And it is 8 o'clock on the dot in Amsterdam. Welcome everybody at the Geopolitics of Technology series, an initiative of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, ACES, the Duitsland Institute Amsterdam, the Stichting Neue Verantwortung, and this session is organized in collaboration with GigaNet, the Global Internet Governance Academic Network. I am Niels ten Hoever. Good evening. I will be your host tonight. I am the co-principal investigator of the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the Media Studies Department at the University of Amsterdam. Before we dive into today's session, let me already point towards the next session in the Geopolitics of Technology series, which will be held at the 23rd of March, so please put it in your agenda, which will be called Europe and the Technologies of Others, the Geopolitics of Foreign Technologies. But today, we talk about the politics of disconnection. The possible establishment of a sovereign internet in Russia, European initiatives on digital sovereignty, and the conflict between China and the United States over Huawei equipment, as well as the conflict in Ukraine, are rekindling the discussion on splinter nets and the limits to global interconnectivity. Can the internet, the original network of networks, resist the contemporary strain, or was it built to actually accommodate these differences? In this talk, 3 expert scholars on this topic are with us, and I'd like to introduce them shortly to you. Firstly, there is Fernanda Rosa. Fernanda is an assistant professor in the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Virginia Tech. She's currently working on her second book project that builds a bridge between technical discussions on internet interconnection infrastructure and social justice to discuss internet governance and design from the standpoint of the Global South. Using an original method defined as co-ethnography and transdisciplinary lens founded on science and technology studies, decolonial and feminist studies, the book sheds light on the information circulation infrastructure of the internet with a design justice and policy approach. It situates the reader in indigenous and Latin American context to problematize the inequalities in the access to internet infrastructure and the circulation of Global South data online. Her fieldwork has been developed in Brazil, Mexico, Cetal, Zapoteco, sovereign territories, and Germany, a European counterpoint. And while we're at Germany, we also have with us Daniel Lambach. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cologne, and he is currently a Heisenberg Fellow at the Research Center Normative Orders at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. And he is a lecturer at the Faculty of Social Science of the University of Duisburg-Essen. His recent publications include narratives of digital sovereignty in German political discourse, but also the territorialization of cyberspace. With us is also Francesca Musiani, who is an associate research professor at the French National Center for Scientific Research since 2014. She is deputy director of the Center for Internet and Society of CNRS, which she co-founded in 2019. She's also an associate researcher at the Center for the Sociology of Innovation and a global fellow at the Internet Governance Lab, American University in Washington, D.C. She is the author with Senia Ermoshima of the excellent book Concealing for Freedom, The Making of Encryption, Secure Messaging, and Digital Liberties, and co-author of the study Splinternets, addressing the renewed debate on internet fragmentation. And then we also have with us Professor Milton Muller, who is an internationally prominent scholar specializing in the political economy of information and communication. He is the author of 7 books and many journal articles, and his work informs not only public policy, but science and technology studies, law, economics, communications, and international studies. His book, Will the Internet Fragment, from 2017, Network and States, The Global Politics of Internet Governance and Ruling the Root, which I couldn't find, but I definitely have somewhere here, are recognized scholarly accounts of the global governance regime emerging around the internet. Muller's research employs the theoretical tools of institutional economics, STS, and political economy, as well as historical, qualitative, and quantitative methods. Dr. Muller is the co-founder and director of the Internet Governance Project, and a policy analysis center that has played a prominent role in shaping internet policies and institutions such as ICANN and the Internet Governance Forum. Well, it must be really clear you are in a great audience to discuss all these issues tonight with us. So that also gives me a good reason to give actually the floor to the real experts. And we'll start with the speakers giving a Daniel, Fernanda, and Francesca, giving us a short introduction and an impulse on their visions. Then Milton will function as a discussant, and they'll shortly discuss among themselves. And then I'd love to go to the questions and remarks of the audience that you can put in the Q&A, and that we will then discuss with the panel. So I'm greatly looking forward, and without further ado, now over to Daniel. Daniel, please come in.
Great, thank you, Niels. Thanks for the kind words of introduction, and thank you for the organizers for putting together this excellent panel and also inviting me, and also to our guests for turning up on a Wednesday night. In my brief remarks here, I want to talk about, or actually I don't want to talk, but I will talk about digital sovereignty, which is a very popular term these days in Europe. And I want to make 3 points. The first is that digital sovereignty is useful for politics, but bad for policy. The second is that the EU and member states governments use it to articulate a position in the face of a digitalization that is perceived as hostile. And the third point is that I'd much rather talk about digital territory rather than sovereignty. As for the first point, digital sovereignty is not a very helpful term, I would argue. It means different things to different people. And within the EU, it means, for example, regulating internet platforms, attracting semiconductor fabs. It means better economic competitiveness for digital industries. It means media literacy. And I don't see a coherent whole forming out of these parts. For Russia and China, it means making sure the people don't topple the regime. So digital sovereignty in Europe is a useful term in politics to mobilize different constituencies and unite them behind a badly defined slogan. It is analytically weak, it offers little guidance for policy, and to me it's more of an aspiration or a vision. I'm not arguing that we shouldn't talk about sovereignty in relation to the digital at all, just that we should be a bit more judicious. For example, there is a relevant and important literature on indigenous data sovereignty, but I'm not convinced that it adds a lot when we look at the European Union. For example, I would much rather talk about or use terms like regulation and jurisdiction. So how do states make sure that internet companies follow laws? Who has legal standing to enforce these rules? Or maybe autonomy. Who has what kind of capacity to make decisions, and in how far are they dependent on other actors? Or authority, who's empowered to make what kind of decision, and how is such authority legitimized? Or maybe responsibility, whose task is it to provide what kind of service to whom, and where should we get the standards for behavior on and with regard to cyberspace from? I would like to see more discussion in these terms, but sovereignty sort of conflates all of these into a badly defined mix and then lathers it in unhelpful associations. So there are some things I'd much rather talk about, but before I do that, I need to acknowledge that the digital sovereignty discourse exists for a reason. And in my view, the reason is that the normative hegemony about the internet is fraying. So what drives the discussion is, in my view, a disappointment how the internet has developed. And this shift has been very pronounced in Europe, I would argue. In very broad strokes, we move from this slightly more optimistic narrative of the 90s and the 2000s into a very different point of view in the 2010s, where we start to perceive the internet as a source of social problems, as being plagued by mass data collection and surveillance by foreign intelligence agencies and corporations, as in addition to the ongoing regulatory problems and frustrations. So the new European viewpoint is that social order must be defended against the web. This also ties into a general sense that digital technology is becoming a site of geopolitical struggle. These narratives of a Chinese-US tech war are becoming quite influential over here. And to me, digital sovereignty is an attempt to articulate a European position in the face of this challenge. So I understand why we are talking so much about digital sovereignty, even though I would rather not. I have no illusions, though, that the political discourse can be shifted, but we can do better analytically. And I would like to use the sort of the final 2 minutes I have to make an offering here. I would much rather talk about digital territory. In political science, we may connect this to the state a bit too readily, but in the broader sense that political geography offers us, I think territory is a really helpful term. Territories are bounded spaces of control, no more, no less. But importantly, they are not predetermined, they're not pre-existing, but they are socially constructed, or rather, in this case, techno-socially constructed and embodied and performed. And that's why I would like to think of territory in terms of practices of reification, of boundary making, and of power, which constitute digital spaces. And that can be done by users, by corporations, and by states. Of course, territorialization by states is a concern, and Niels in his introduction has highlighted some recent points which might worry us. They haven't managed to break the internet so far, but signs aren't exactly pointing into an encouraging direction. But users also do that. I've done some work on Reddit communities, and I think Fernando's work on indigenous community networks would also fit here. But I think we should be much more concerned about the corporate territorialization of the internet. Platforms have successfully brought back the walled gardens of yesteryear. Social media platforms have monopolized user-generated content. From the blogosphere, Twitter has just is in the process of shutting down its APIs. So this doesn't look healthy at all. Even the sort of softer ecosystem-based approach is also quite harmful. Boundaries exist there too, even though they are less obvious, but they work through lock-in effects. Now, to conclude, I think thinking about territory opens discussions how material infrastructures prefigure certain digital spaces, or how digital territories are embedded into technologies. So these are conversations I would much rather have, because they would allow us to look at the tensions between the network character of the internet and a territorial form of politics applied to that, much rather than any other or just another digital sovereignty discussion. Thank you.
Daniel, thanks so much. And I love the move you're making. And yeah, okay, I'll hold back without diving directly into this, but it's concept of digital territory. Very exciting. But we're now continuing to Rose. I'd like to ask Fernanda to follow up with, I think, formal, it fits well, or it might even contrast. Fernanda.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Please
Very
let
well.
me know. Good. Thank you so much. So I'll just set my timer here. Thank you so much for this. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. Thank you, Nils, and his team for organizing this. Thank you also for my colleagues. I feel very, very honored to be part of this table. I'm currently based in Virginia, United States, in Tutelo and Monaco lands, and I have been working on topics related to the politics of connection and disconnection from the standpoint of Latin America and small internet service providers, or ISPs, including indigenous ISPs that we can simply call indigenous networks. I am an ethnographer, and I look at internet infrastructure from the bottom up to see what we can learn from mundane experiences in internet governance, as Francesca Musiani and her colleagues would say. So from this vantage point, I would like to address 2 points here for us to start this conversation. And if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to bring them up in the discussion, and I will really appreciate it. And I'm very happy that I'm talking after Daniels, because I could not agree more with the idea of bringing territory to the conversation as a concept, because this also helps us to bring infrastructure to the conversation and to materialize our discussions into what is material when we talk about the internet. So my first point here is that networks or internet networks are not equal, and the strategies of connection and disconnection will vary based on that. So we all know that the internet is a network of networks, and that networks need to interconnect among themselves for them to become part of the internet. This interconnection is not only logical, but physical, with computers, cables, routers distributed all over the world, and it happens somewhere geographically. So our data is circulating somewhere all the time. So as an internet user, when you contract the service of an internet service provider at home, you become part of their network, and they are responsible for connecting you to the content that you want to access. If you want to use a social media website, your ISP needs to find where this content is in the world to interconnect you to such content, no matter where their servers are available. If we stay with the social media example in mind, we can think about the concentration of these platforms born in the US market, owned by companies that we usually call big tech, like Meta, who owns Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, or Microsoft, who owns LinkedIn. We can also think of TikTok, owned by the Chinese ByteDance. These companies have huge infrastructure and distribute their servers in the world as they evaluate if it is efficient and profitable. So ISPs around the world, including yours at home, can connect to them, to these servers, the easiest way possible. But here is a thing that I would like to bring to you that happens when we are not paying attention, because we just pay our ISPs to give connection to us. But if your ISP is a big one and has many clients in your country, they can make interconnection arrangements with these content intermediaries, like the social media companies, saying, please place your server in my network, in my headquarters, and then you have access to, let's say, 60% of internet users in my country. So for social media websites, this is a good deal because their goal is to be closer to users. So their service will be faster, will take less time to load on your screen, etc. So everything is fine when we have big tech with big ISPs. However, small ISPs do not have such a negotiation power to bring this big tech content to their networks, and their clients also want to be connected to them. So they have 2 options. The first, which is the cheapest and the most preferable for them, is to join other small and medium ISPs in some interconnection facilities. These interconnection facilities are called internet exchange points. So when small ISPs are together, they increase the chances of content intermediaries like the social media websites to interconnect to that facilities. So these small ISPs are also able to peer with each other in these facilities, meaning that they increase their chances of saving money when exchanging data packets. But if these big tech corporations decide to not bring their servers to these internet exchange points where these small ISPs are, the second option that they have would be to pay a transit fee for an internet access provider to bring that social media content to them. So what my research has shown is that the cost of interconnection in the Global South for these arrangements and these interconnection arrangements to happen, these costs are much superior in the Global South than they are in the Global North. And here I'm talking not only in terms of economic costs. In political science, for example, we talk about the cost to vote, the cost to participate in democracy. So it's a political cost, which also includes economic issues, but also infrastructure issues, among others. So, for example, approximately 38% of countries classified as Global North have a big tech public point of interconnection. But while only 16% of those classified as Global South do. Apple has approximately 92% of its presence in the Global North, followed by Amazon, that is 82%, Facebook 73%, and Google 72%. So this is published as a paper in Policy and Internet in 2002 with a colleague who is Janice Roche. And to be clear here, these discussions on inequalities in interconnection, because of the availability of this big tech or the availability of interconnection points, has been debated for a while. The report of the Working Group on Internet Governance in 2005 already pointed clearly that ISPs from developing countries had to pay higher and uneven interconnection costs to access the internet. But years later, what our research is showing is that the concentration of power around some corporations are also generating other overlooked concentrations at the level of internet interconnection infrastructure, forming giant internet nodes, including Amsterdam, that will attract data from Global South citizens to these facilities. When big tech companies do interconnection arrangements with incumbents in a Global South country and do not interconnect in IXPs in that countries, this impacts the competition between small and big internet service providers. And for internet users, this means fewer ISPs to choose upon and may also mean higher internet monthly fees. So here, what I'm saying is that internet networks are not the same. It depends on where they are and the interconnection arrangements available to them. So the politics of connection and disconnection is then not dissociated from the politics of interconnection. And to finalize, I will give you a second point, but I'll not extend because my time already ended. So I'll just share with you during 2 minutes these photos. For you to see this. I said that networks are not the same, but there are networks that are not even considered networks, generating all sorts of complications when it comes to connection and disconnection. One example I've been working with are indigenous networks in sovereign Zapoteco, Celtal, and Celtal territories in Mexico. For networks to officially exist in internet architecture, they need to be identified with autonomous system number. Due to the ways that these indigenous networks interconnect to the internet via Elon Musk, Starlink, or arrangements in house rooftops, they are rendered invisible. So the implications are various, including the fact that we end up ignoring the labor of these people as internet co-designers and their relevance in the internet governance arena. So to finalize my talk, I'd like to say that the politics of connection disconnection is deeply shaped by code and infrastructure, which needs to be studied along with people lived experience as a way for us to de-westernize the internet. So I should be sharing this. I hope you are seeing the change in the pictures. And here is the last picture that I took recently, where we see Elon Musk's satellite internet with Starlink. So thank you so much. I'll pass the floor to Niels.
Thanks so much, Fernanda, for giving us another understanding of politics of connection and disconnection, allowing us to further think and conceptualize this, and also decenter from a normalized or very current discourses. And now we continue to Professor Dr. Musiani. Francesca, please come in.
Thank you so much, Niels. Well, really, thanks a lot for inviting me to discuss in the frame of this very promising event, which had like a first round of organization a few months ago. So in the frame of my initial remarks, I wish to say a few things about two hot topics in internet governance discussion today. One has already been addressed by Daniel, and actually there is some overlapping what I intended to say with what he already said, which I totally subscribe to, so I will keep it like shorter, that second part, but happy to rediscuss it afterwards. And the second one hasn't been really addressed so far, and that is internet fragmentation. So both of these terms are really mobilized in a variety of ways today. Oftentimes they are contested, and I think that tonight is a great opportunity to try and further discuss what their conceptualization is. So in terms of internet fragmentation, broad contested concept, the term is used in the academic literature and policy circles to refer to a wide range of phenomena and patterns, such as the complete disconnection of systems from the global internet, referred to as technical fragmentation, or manifestations of variations in internet users' experiences when accessing online content, which would be more defined as content fragmentation. As a global network of compatible autonomous systems, the internet is by definition connected, yet it is structurally fragmented into various segments. And the notion of internet fragmentation indeed embeds somewhat of a paradox, as it conceptualizes the internet as an unfragmented pre-existing whole, as Jim Bradbois told to me and my team during the research for the report that Niels mentioned, and it came out for the European Parliament last year. So with my colleagues, Clément Perranneau, Julien Rossi, and Lucien Castex, in that report, we have addressed the term, but also its concrete embodiments. And our definition of technical fragmentation in this report, it's a working definition, very subject to debate, but we define it as the result of choices that intentionally or unintentionally break, restrict, or suspend the technical connectivity between a part of the internet and the rest of the network. And we chose to highlight the possible unintentionality of this, building on previous definitions, including Milton's foundational one. As for instance, we have found in our research for the report that technical fragmentation may indeed at times be the unintended byproduct of divergent technological choices. It may only isolate a non-significant part of the population, may be only temporary, but still can be configured as some form of fragmentation. Of course, to complicate things further, there are many concepts that are used to illustrate in practice this notion of internet fragmentation and its implications. The term splinternet, which designates a part of the internet that would secede and become inaccessible to other nodes for either technological or political reasons, or both. Similarly, balkanization of the internet is an expression with somewhat of a negative connotation, used to characterize patterns of divisions leading to smaller and implicitly incompatible units. And the process of fragmentation can apply both to the internet as infrastructure and to the internet as a public space. This is where, in addition to technical fragmentation as such, content fragmentation comes in, and it can also occur where connectivity is maintained at a technical level, but users are still restricted in their practical access to content. And this may happen, for example, when a website can still be reached through its IP address, but has had its corresponding entry deleted from the nominated system servers used by users ISP, requiring the user to take specific action to restore access. So there are all these meanings and these facets to this concept of fragmentation. So I think that it's fairly relevant today to the geopolitics of connection and disconnection. So I'd be happy to include in the second part of the event some discussion of it. As for the second, so digital sovereignty, as mentioned, I'm overlapping with Daniel here, but I would like to point out that one of the reasons why so many people are currently dissatisfied with its widespread use and at the same time use it in a widespread fashion is that it is employed as a sort of an all-encompassing label for what are actually, if examined empirically, a large variety of practices and claims. So the term has increasingly been put forward in the last decade to convey the idea that states should reassert their authority over the internet and protect their citizens and businesses from challenges to their autonomy and independence from a digital standpoint. And so as a consequence, we have enlarged this label not only to speak of what so-called authoritarian regimes do, and for a pretty long time the label has been exclusively associated with these regimes. It is no longer the case. And so at the latest, since the Snowden revelations about the pervasive surveillance activities of the US and other Western intelligence agencies, various actors in established democracies are also using the digital sovereignty concept to emphasize their claims to self-determination. So what the European Union is doing in this space, for example, is largely refers to this exception of digital sovereignty. So for all of these reasons, and because states have convinced their citizenry that sovereignty and state authority are necessary to protect a number of vital goods: security, prosperity, cultural norms, diversity, media control. The concept of digital sovereignty is a powerful political discourse, and increasingly, though, it is not exclusively linked to states and their capacity for self-determination, but it is put forward by civil society, minority groups, specific communities to articulate specific claims for increased capacities for self-determination and decision-making vis-a-vis powerful economic players or dominant state actors. So despite, like, we recognize all of this, it's in the making, but we are still lacking, I think, systematic assessments of what digital sovereignty claims are about and their political and technological consequences. So just to conclude these initial remarks, I would like to suggest that we dedicate some of our time as researchers in the coming years to achieve nuanced and empirically grounded understanding of contemporary discourses and governance mechanisms. Daniel has mentioned that infrastructure becomes a digital sovereignty mechanism and shapes a number of things, or contributes to shape a number of things, including territories. And so all of these governance mechanisms, policies, regulations, practices, infrastructures, we can attempt to produce a nuanced understanding and categorization of how they relate to digital sovereignty, and propose a conceptualization of eventually different types, empirically grounded types of digital sovereignty. And maybe we can move beyond the label by doing so. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much, Francesca, for adding a deeper understanding and also more layers of understanding of what many times seems as a one flat, smooth layer. This is the internet, but also like the cracks, layers, crevices among breaking might happen, but also not in a simple way, but along all these different ways and meanings of fragmentation. That is amazing. So we have so many different understandings now of sovereignty, fragmentation, and how normative hegemony is fraying, but also how it's allowing for the rise of new kinds of governance and providing for other technical orderings. So here I'd like to bring Milton to discuss what has been brought up and share with his reflections on this, and with that also kick off the discussion. Milton, please come in.
Okay, thank you, Niels, and happy to do so. I'm going to start with an anecdote. It's about a conversation actually that Niels and I had that I think, at least in my mind, helped to lead to this event. And we were discussing disconnection, and Niels made an interesting historical observation, one that I was familiar with because I teach kind of the history of telecoms. And he noted that during World War I, as soon as war broke out, all of the governments involved started cutting each other's cables and disabling each other's radio operations. And we both contrasted this with what was now happening with the Ukraine war, in which we were most emphatically not doing that, at least not as much, not as obviously, and not as directly as it was done then. So that leads to the really interesting perspective on the role of communications and communications technologies in the world order, and the degree to which we are creating interdependencies that are in some ways a one-way street, and it is very hard to reverse. And we do know that we're facing some challenges to this kind of level of interconnectivity. We also know that the rise of the internet, which made digital communications globally compatible for the first time with a standard single networking protocol, it created an enormous disruption in the international system, at least in regards to communication and security of communication and information, and also other kinds of security. So let me just go sequentially then through what the other speakers said, starting, of course, with Daniel Lambach. And I'm interested in his connection between the fraying of normative hegemony and the rise of this concept of digital sovereignty. I think that's a correct observation. And I think the reason it's important to understand is because, as I said, the internet protocols essentially destroyed sovereignty in telecommunications and information as we traditionally understood it. We had an earlier debate about that with the rise of satellites in the 1970s, satellite communications, but satellites were still connected to territorial facilities in a way that the internet was not. Not that the internet is floating out there without any connection to physical facilities, but it is the protocol itself is global, open source, and easily adopted by anyone and not owned by anyone in a way that no other communications technology was before. So if it's true that we are sort of reasserting now traditional notions of sovereignty in the context of digital technology, where is that leading us? I think Daniel's sort of dissection of the meaninglessness of a literal meaning of sovereignty in the digital environment was quite good. But it does serve these political functions, and it does serve as a powerful rationalization for various forms of disconnection. We see it with the European, attempt to regulate platforms or to disconnect data flows in ways that could be an assertion of political rights for their citizens, but could also be seen as a form of protectionism or as a form of punishing the American-based platforms precisely because they're not European. And it's very hard to tell those two things apart. Now, I think it's important to talk about digital territory, but if you do that, you have to be very careful that you are not conflating geographic territory and digital territory. So it's important and interesting to think about how one defines a territory in the digital ecosystem. And in my courses now, I'm breaking down the digital ecosystem into 4 elements. That is software, networks, devices, and data. And the thing you have to understand, of course, networks have a clear nexus to geography, as do devices in some sense, in that devices are manufactured and they raise lots of traditional trade issues about how they flow across borders. But software and data are virtual resources, and software in particular is, as an industry, more comparable to writing and literature, and because it's just people creating things out of thin air and then distributing it virtually over this globally interconnected network. And it's very interesting to think about the implications of the way the software industry both controls and is sort of independent of territorial control because of its ability to run and to be distributed in this virtual manner. Let's go on to Fernanda. I'm not really doing justice to the digital territory concept, but we can come back to it in the discussion. So Fernanda is doing, touching on issues really that have been debated for a long time in the context of developing countries and telecommunication networks. That is to say, there is, of course, a cost differential between thick and thin routes. This has been something that's been debated in the US with respect to rural areas for a long time. It's affected the way we regulate interconnection and the pricing of long distance and local service in the US for a long time. And of course, internet service providers are different than traditional telecom circuit switch providers. The interconnection problem is a lot less sticky, and there's a potential for a lot more diversity and competition. But still, you have this problem of the concentration of facilities and resources that creates important economies of scale. And in many ways, economies of scale are good because they make things less expensive if you can realize them. And so it's very interesting to look at this dialectic between localized IXPs and this bargaining process by which a large ISP may or may not decide to participate in a collective interconnection agreement through an IXP. I would like to hear more from Fernanda about how much of a problem that has been, what large ISPs have refused to join IXPs, what effect has it had on the ability of the smaller ones to connect? That would be really interesting to hear about. But what intrigued me most about her talk was this business about indigenous networks without autonomous system numbers. So I think I'd really like to hear more detail about that. We know that, just to give you again historical perspective here, but prior to the internet, the idea of how many networks there should be and how many networks could be sustained was a very limited and closed idea. Right. I remember in the early days of telecom liberalization, there were people in Europe who were talking about liberalizing their systems, and in Latin America and Asia who thought they were being very liberal by saying, we should have a numbering system that allows for 7 competing networks, right? And the internet comes along with ASNs, and it's got like 65,000 networks that can be uniquely numbered. And what do you know? We ran out, and we had to add another bunch of bits to the ASN frame in order to accommodate the number of networks. So the idea that you could just have an unlimited number of networks, of autonomously governed networks, was a really radical thing that really, in general, helped developing countries as much as anybody else. So I'm curious as to how these indigenous networks, what do they connect to without ASNs? Are they not using the internet protocol, or are they getting connected through other networks with ASNs? It would be really interesting to hear about that. In general, however, I didn't hear a lot of geopolitical aspects to Fernanda's talk. I heard some echoes of some early geopolitical concepts about, in the early days of the internet around 2000, Australia was complaining, and some of the Asia Pacific islands were complaining that the broadband cables that connected them were much more expensive, and all of the internet traffic went through the United States, which made it very expensive for them. But generally, these networks did become more localized. They set up a more dense interconnection network, and a lot of those issues died away. So I'm wondering how much that is still an issue, and is it perceived as a geopolitical issue or just an economic issue in the global South? Now, turning to Francesca, we have a discussion about the definition of fragmentation. And again, I think that is kind of an interesting issue. I think the big problem that I tried to introduce when I wrote about that was we don't want to define fragmentation in a way that means, any kind of random problem that you encounter in a network. We want the word fragmentation to be systemic. We want it to be something that really does erect barriers between large numbers of people who are networked. Otherwise, you're just, I think you're elevating the phenomenon to something that doesn't matter. If you can hear the industrial whistle out there, that is a feature of the Georgia Tech campus, which we can talk about if you want. So I think it is important to point out that fragmentation can be unintended, but I think that the real nexus of the issue now is the degree to which there are private economic incentives to create fragmentation, which I would assert there are practically none, that no private actor wants to be disconnected at layer 3. They may want to have exclusivity in the data that they collect, and they may want to have exclusivity in the features of their applications at the application layer, but applications can be easily duplicated and accessed through the universal internet protocol at layer 3 and 4. So fragmentation at the application layer is not, in my opinion, really the kind of fragmentation we need to be worried about, unless and until somebody that controls an operating system, let's say an Apple or a Google, decides that they don't want to make their operating system interact with the other one through these lower level protocols at layer 3 and 4. And I see very little chance of that happening. I just think the economic incentives are against it. And turning on to Francesca's discussion of digital sovereignty, it's correct that it is a single label for a large variety of claims, as she put it. Mainly about, I think it is mainly about states reasserting their authority. So I view the whole digital sovereignty discussion as an extremely reactionary one. But she did bring up this interesting phenomenon of people using the word to refer to their own individual self-determination in the digital environment. So sometimes you hear this called sovereignty, sometimes something like self-sovereignty, or the identity people who talk about sovereignty, digital sovereignty, through having your own autonomous identity on the internet. And again, I think that's a confusing conflation of terms, because they mean almost exactly the opposite thing, right? Digital sovereignty, as states are using it, it means a reassertion of their territorial control over the digital ecosystem. And when the individuals use it, they're talking about freeing themselves from states and from perhaps also big technology companies in terms of their interaction with the digital ecosystem. So in general, I think I'm surprised at how little discussion there was of the truly geopolitical aspects of disconnection. I mean, I'm thinking of, the US now, we're having a huge debate about whether we should ban TikTok. That is, the United States is literally talking about setting up a Chinese style firewall that decides what apps will or will not be allowed in our country. We have denied the landing rights to cables that have 1/3 Chinese ownership. We have kicked out Chinese telecom firms. I think Europe and the United States and various Western-oriented Asian countries like Australia have kicked Huawei out of their infrastructure. I think we really need to be contemplating the implications of, by being digitally connected. Yes, clearly we are subjecting ourselves to some digital vulnerabilities, but we're also realizing tremendous economic advantages and communication and cooperative advantages. And we are now launching ourselves willy-nilly into a discussion of that trade-off in which the sort of militant national security advocates seem to have the upper hand, and the internet community, I think, needs to push back. I'll leave it at that. Look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Milton. And here I would like to give the floor to the panelists to respond to Milton. Daniel, would you like to start off?
Yes, sure. And thanks everyone for your contributions, and Milton for the comments. Yeah, I don't think I disagree much with you. Maybe a few points of clarification. I mean, you're right in pointing out that my critique of digital sovereignty does not mean that it doesn't have effect. It might be sort of an almost empty signifier, but it still produces something. And what does it produce? Well, bit early to say maybe, and I'm reminded of Francesca's call for more sort of empirical engagements with what the policies that are engendered by these discourses actually give us. I mean, we now have the DMA and the DSA, and they will affect how platforms work in Europe and will shape networks too. It's a bit early to tell, of course. I'm not seeing sort of a widespread fragmentation event, but this is more work to be done in the future, to be sure. Secondly, about digital territory, I completely agree. We should be very careful about not conflating it with physical territory. There are interesting linkages, as you pointed out, between aspects of the internet and aspects of cyberspace and physical space, but it's complicated. So maybe 3 points why I love territory so much. First of all, it's very clear that territory is a social construction. Secondly, we can think of territories as overlapping, not as exclusive. So we can have state territories and corporate territories and user territories, and all of us sort of us existing in multiple of these territories at the same time. And then we can sort of talk about the interaction between these territories and the rules that are sort of expressed through them. And thirdly, it's a bit more fluid, and we can sort of then move on to question of extraterritoriality. So things like the GDPR basically being sort of accepted worldwide to be able to serve users in Europe is one of these examples. I'm sure we can think of other ones. So I like territory because it's a more flexible notion, and it's less tied to the notion of the state than sovereignty is. Now, it does raise another question, which complicates the picture further. I mean, where does this lead us when the boundaries between the digital and the physical are breaking down? Still a bit futuristic, but I mean, with geolocation techniques and the like, we are sort of creating more points of interconnection. We're creating more sensors that feed physical data into data spaces. So I think there's lots of stuff coming our way, and we have really no way so far of making much sense of that.
Yeah, that's excellent, because we see the battle going down the stack, right? With Facebook and Amazon providing 5G services, and at the same time, we see like all the telcos go over IP, but also a telecomunication of the internet, because all the telcos have become ISPs, and it's oligopolizing. But I won't monopolize the conversation. Fernanda, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such a good conversation. So yeah, Milton, thank you for your comments. I cannot disagree with you about how long these discussions about inequalities between developing and developed countries that we now call Global South and Global North are on the table. And what surprises me is how we have not addressed such a thing in a way that now what we see is that these inequalities are going on and on in other layers of our architecture. And this is important because when we talk about concentration in terms of companies, of content, we are not necessarily looking at the concentration that is being generated at the level of infrastructure. And I understand what you and Daniel talk about, how territory should be dissociated of the physical territory. Actually, I would even suggest if Daniel wanna see something that helps to make his argument, if you go to Native CA, something like that, you see the indigenous territories in the world and how they overlap. I think that's a great way for us to think of how this is socially constructed and how this overlap exists. However, to my point, for me, the fact that we have disregarded geography and physical territory in the way that we discuss inequalities on the internet is a huge problem, because now what we are seeing is that the concentration of power, concentration of content in the global north, data from citizens from the global south going through countries in the global north. And for example, as I do field work in some we call surveillance countries as Germany, the fact that some internet service providers in Brazil interconnect to the larger internet in Frankfurt at the KIX, that is one of the biggest IXPs in the world, brings some concerns, big concerns about surveillance, for example. So this is why I would not disregard territory at all. And I would go then to the next point that that Milton did about the effects that we have had about big ISPs not connecting to IXPs. For example, in Mexico, we have a big example of the main incumbents just disregarding the laws and the orders to interconnect there, and using BGP to circumvent the law, because they understand so well the protocol that they are also using BGP to circumvent the law, saying, hey, I am interconnected here. However, they interconnect an ASN that has not data, and this ASN is the ASN that is considered the incumbent in the law of telecommunications. But then they have an ASN that has data, but is not considered an incumbent. So they are just saying, because in the law we are not the incumbent, so we should not interconnect to the IXP. But that ASN is part of the holding. So this is published as a paper as well, and we can talk about that more. Another example about this is when, for example, Brazil has a policy about having IXPs all over the country, because it's a continental country. So the idea is that the more IXPs we have, the better the quality of the internet will be, including for small ISPs in the north, close to the Amazon, all that sort. However, content providers just decide to be in the biggest one, the biggest IXP, which is in Sao Paulo. And the small ISPs in the north of the country needs to create their own alternatives to interconnect to the IXP in Sao Paulo, or, as I've seen, to go to other countries to make this interconnection. So these are some examples that we see how the politics of this of big tech affects the way that interconnection is happening in the countries. And regarding the indigenous networks, how do they do? What they do is they build their own infrastructure, their local network, and then they need to find where internet is, basically. And usually internet is in bigger towns or the capital city. So they build their infrastructure with Wi-Fi and antennas, radio antennas, until that place. And they just contract the internet from the ISPs that are available there. This is one way. The other way is has been very recent. They hire Starlink, like they buy Starlink by a huge amount, and then they have this interconnection with the internet through Starlink. And then I loved when you commented, Milton, about the satellite discussions that we have had historically, because now we are talking about this with indigenous people, and then I'll take us to the idea of digital sovereignty, because imagine what is going on now. So Elon Musk is entering indigenous territory without asking, because people need internet and they are then buying that equipment. Well, if this will be the only way that this community is going to have access to the internet, once this company decides to shut down the internet, so everything is shut down. So this is just one example, but there are other examples that we could go on discussing. And then to finalize, what happens here about my way of looking at geopolitical issues is that, for me, infrastructure is geopolitical, and companies are geopolitical. So codes, BGP is geopolitical. They are all geopolitical actors. And for me, when I have Starlink coming to these indigenous territories, I see the politics of the US liberalism being transmitted into that design of that infrastructure. So for me, that politics is also embedded in design. And that's when, for me, geopolitics cannot be dissociated from the role of companies when we talk about that in internet governance. So it's not only about governments, it's about companies, and it's about code. So to finalize, I even work with code ethnography to look at code as an actor, asking questions to code as we ask questions to people to understand what is their role when we are talking about this. So thank you so much.
Does the code talk back to you when you ask it questions?
Yeah, I thanks so much for that, Fernanda. I think that's really great. I really like your concept of code ethnography, and I think it will travel really far. Also with other concepts such as parallel operation, which hackers have been using already in the operation of telecommunication infrastructures to reverse engineer it and open it to undo these black boxes and see what is inscribed. And I fully agree on the concept of on the geopolitical aspect of satellites. I mean, if we need to look back as where the internet started, it would be October 1957 with the launch of Sputnik, which was a satellite, but was actually just a device put on an intercontinental ballistic missile, which then inspired the US to set up ARPANET, the ARPA, and then set up the internet. So there's this inherent relationship between militarism, space, and communication networks, and I think we shouldn't underestimate also the military interest in Starlink, and also understand space that is done now as a deeply colonial project, right? Because it's also about communal space, the air that we see, but also, like, is there really a democratic governance of space and the recolonization of Earth from space, right? So I'm very thankful for you bringing up these concepts and helping us think those through. Francesca, please.
Thank you. So yeah, I'll be very brief. First of all, yeah, thanks, Milton, for your feedback. Very rich and a lot of food for thought, as usual, with you. I actually wanted to point out as a somewhat of a response, but it's more like an opening for the possible like last half an hour of discussion. Something that I tried to highlight in my opening remarks on both, I would say, the concept of internet fragmentation and the concept of digital sovereignty, that I think that they are from an academic standpoint, like the standpoint of the researcher right now, they are somewhat similar concepts, as in concepts that have a relatively long history of being theorized, and they have been put like perimeters on, they have been defined and so on by some disciplinary traditions more than others. And I think that right now they are at a moment in which they are used as kind of a frontier boundary objects by lots of communities and actors and political strategies and political discourses, and they are being made to say lots of things that can, as you rightly point out, go as far as meaning quite the opposite things between, for example, state digital sovereignty and digital sovereignty understood as individual empowerment by means of digital tools, right? So I think that there is some value at this particular moment in time in policy and in policy engaged research to look at, as STS people say, take this fact seriously, like the fact that these concepts are being pushed and thrown like a ball among different actors, and really like retrace how this is going and why this has been done. And from this we can, I think, not do comparisons. I do not see a lot of value in doing like comparisons in a classical sense between these different conceptualizations and practices of these concepts, but we can try and categorize them and try and in this way have our research to be a little bit useful for political deciders that have to take at some point decisions about engaging in policies concerning sovereignty or fragmentation or both, and try to make it visible, like the extent to which these concepts are mobilized in different ways by different actors. So, yeah, and I guess that this is what I was trying to point out in the initial remarks, and perhaps it's spelled out more in this way.
Yeah, fantastic. And maybe for some, I'd like to see if there's some comments from the audience who have been patiently, but also I'm pretty sure excitedly waiting for this excellent conversation. So there is a question from Siva Subramaniam, which I'll read. It says, Milton, hypothetically, if indeed a company such as Huawei from anywhere happened to be a global security threat, wouldn't it be a matter of non-compliance of internet standards and norms? And in that case, wouldn't it have been appropriate to treat this as a global geography agnostic issue for which the penalties or prohibitions came from the internet governance organizations rather than from a government or a region?
Well, we have an advocate of internet self-governance on the line, I can see. That goes beyond even where I would be in terms of promoting internet self-governance. So I have argued, yes, that if the problem with Huawei is that it is a cybersecurity threat, then it primarily should be treated not as a matter of national origin, which it is being treated as in the US at least, and maybe other countries. That is, if Huawei is a security threat, it's not simply because it's Chinese, it's because there are things that it does that are cybersecurity, creating vulnerabilities or exploiting threats. And this would indeed be something that would best be addressed by global standards. However, the internet community, as you describe it, Siva, would not have the authority to do anything about that, frankly. I mean, what would exactly they do? Suppose that they have defined a a protocol or a way of implementing internet protocol in their networks that somehow spills data to the Chinese government. The internet community cannot say, you must change your equipment. They can just say, we've written this standard and you're not compliant, and that's about it.
Yeah, and what is so interesting, I think, that vulnerabilities have not been shown in Huawei products. No backdoors have actually been detected whatsoever in Huawei products. Quite the opposite. When we did an analysis of standardization of lawful interception technologies in the main standardization body for 5G, the 3GPP, the link that I'll share here, I'm not sure I can share it actually with all participants, but you can find it if you search for the standardization of lawful interception technologies in the 3GPP. We found that it's actually the United States and Europe that are standardizing lawful intercept in 5G, and that it's actually not China setting the standards, but China is implementing all the standards that are requested by Europe and the US. So I think that in the politics of disconnection, I think it's also very important to see the disconnect between the discourse and the material ordering. But it doesn't mean that there are no disconnections in the technical orderings, because that might also be a mistake that one could make, right? And with this, I'd really like to underline Fernanda's call that we should really look at the material orderings that lie underneath, instead for going with the maybe not always so contentful political concepts as mentioned by Daniel. Then there was also a
hands on, yeah. No, I see hands up. I would just say, let's not forget Kalea, right? It is here for how long in our routers, and asking our ISPs to disprogram Kalea from the routers, because it is their programmed forever.
Exactly.
Kalea is a circuit switched surveillance technology. And then there was an interesting, I think it was like 1999, 2000, where the US federal government said to the IETF, okay, we've done Kalea for circuit switching, and now we want you to do some similar thing for the internet. And they said no. Speaking of autonomy. I would just like to use this opportunity to raise a question.
The NSA went in and via ISO built in weak curves, right?
The Federal Communications Commission essentially passed regulations that forced American internet companies to comply with Kalea as internet service providers using different standards. But let me ask Fernanda a question. So she mentioned this about the satellite access for the indigenous networks, right? And you characterize this as, the liberal order sort of reaching down into whatever it is, Brazil or Venezuela. But I view it as kind of strange that you're not viewing that as an act of agency by the indigenous networks themselves. In other words, the state-ordered national regulatory system is saying, we give you no alternatives to connect, but here's something coming from the global order, purely motivated by market mechanisms. That is to say, he wants to sell his satellite devices primarily, and or wants to sell service, and what's wrong with that? Why would you characterize that as colonial? Let's put it that way.
Should we give space for Alexander first or not? Should I respond to Milton? I'm just asking our moderator, because his hands are up for a while.
This is thank you so much. So Alexander, if you want, you can come in via audio or video, but you can also do it via text. So I'll let Fernanda respond, and then Fatima will send you an invite. If you don't want to, you can also respond via text or only. Oh, there you are, Alexander.
Yeah, okay,
great.
I can turn on audio, but I will not allow you to turn on video. Actually, I wanted to respond mostly to Milton. about his question about how big ISPs works with small ISPs. We had this in Russia, I think, around beginning of the century, when internet in Russia was free, and it was called peering wars. When major ISPs who considered them big refused to peer with smaller ones, and also they refused to have free peering between each other. So it was like they were disputing who is Russian tier ones, and a lot of traffic was going through Europe because it was much cheaper for business. It was big business intentions. And actually, first of all, it did not lead to splinternet or to fragmentation. It led to development of market. So smaller ISPs got their connections to Europe, and actually bigger ones had to lower their prices and make their peering policy more reflex. So in this case, the kind of free market works very, very good. And if Niels allows a little comment about geopolitics, because Milton also asked this. First of all, for years, I think since 2003 until about 2018, Russia was the second biggest internet by number of autonomous system numbers, by number of routing actors. And around 2018, Brazil overtook Russia, because in Russia, since 2012, it's starting content blocking, talks about sovereign internet, lawful intercept called SORM, Eurovia, content storage, and also, so in Russia, we see decline the number of autonomous system numbers and routing, but in Brazil, there is growth. And I think a few months ago, China overtook Russia, so Russia is now fourth in this case. Congratulations, Brazil. And another little note, I'll try to be very accurate because I'm Russian, and Russia now, unfortunately, in war with Ukraine. Another disconnection, geopolitical thing, that's in Ukraine, when Putin started invasion to Ukraine, regulator issued an order to local ISPs and telephone companies to disconnect from Russian companies. So there is an order from Ukrainian regulator with a list of autonomous system numbers and networks which should be disconnected. I think it was first ever order of such kind on the earth. And there is a really different perception in Ukraine related to this, because at that moment, telecommunication infrastructure between Russia and Ukraine actually was one of two major connections of Russia to European internet. So there's one connection was through Scandinavia, and another goes through Ukraine, which was used by independent ISPs. And different actors in Ukraine reacted differently. Some disconnected completely. Some have not disconnected, showing dissent. In some cases, that's okay. We would not do this. Even they were not supporting Putin. They were Ukrainian patriots by showing dissent, and actually there are already political immigrants from ISPs to Europe. But most of companies have not disconnected, have not broke their physical connections and BGP connections in Europe. So they disconnected from Russian ISPs going through Russian-Ukrainian borders, but they still have peering on ISPs. They still have possibility to allow traffic flow. So that's it's really sad that such example we have to study somehow, but it exists, and actually, again, I think it's another topic to study maybe in future, how it works. Thanks.
Thanks so much for that incredibly relevant contribution, Alexander. And I would like to also point to the excellent work by Douzet et al. That I'll share in the chat on measuring the fragmentation of the internet in the case of the Border Gateway Protocol during the Ukraine crisis, because there is a very interesting way to understand how the territorial and the topological map onto each other. And indeed, as Milton said, as Rita Sajat in her excellent book, Reluctant Power, shows how states exert power outside of their territory via transnational communication networks and would use to cut cables. What we see in Ukraine is that communication infrastructure is both the target of cyber attacks and physical attacks. But when territories are taken, you often see a reappropriation of the communication infrastructure, but then through a different configuration. And very interesting work by and Savi and others is also about how that then is used through SORM, but also through TSPU, Russia's decentralized censorship system. So you will be still connected to the internet, but with a different flavor. And this would be a way of fragmentation, but we often not only implemented through Russian systems, but then also SORM has for a long time been provided by Nokia, right? So there's also here the thing that states and companies are not the same, but sometimes they do play the same. For instance, in the case of Starlink, I think it's also dangerous to say that it is just a company, also because it has very big contracts for the US Space Development Agency of at least $150 million, which is aimed, among others, at battle management, missile tracking, weapons targeting, and deterrence. So, I think it's at least part of the truth to say that Starlink is just a connectivity provider. It's definitely also part of a military infrastructure. But thanks so much for bringing all these points up, Alexander. Does anyone would like to respond?
Well, I would just say that that was very valuable information, Alexander, and it's good to hear from you. I wonder where you are at the moment. One person told me, I can't remember if it was Alexander or somebody else, that one of the reasons Russia had such a tough time controlling its telecom infrastructure and lagged the Chinese in so many ways was because of liberalization, so that they had these competitive telecom firms with distinct networks that were much harder to set up a centralized gateway for control in Russia. So I think that what you're saying sort of feeds into that. The small ISPs could get connectivity from outside Russia and come back in, and ultimately that exerted competitive pressure on the big boys, and suddenly they had to lower their prices. Very interesting.
Can I very quickly say something?
Please do, of course, Francesca.
No, it's just that I posted a link. I'm not sure who is actually able to see it, but it's about, it's a special issue of First Monday that we co-edited with a colleague a couple of years ago, which has a collection of paper about the infrastructure-based control points in the Russian internet. And what Milton just said, and before Alexander, is one of the main points that we try to elaborate upon in several papers. That is to say, the fact that for quite some time the history of the Russian internet was not necessarily one of authoritarianism and sovereignization by means of coercive means. And so now that they seem to have that as their strategy of the past decade, it's a little bit more difficult for them to actually really isolate themselves and self-determinate themselves as they perhaps to the extent they would like to.
Yeah, it's so interesting that and I think Daniel also made this point in his earlier paper. Sorry if I'm making your argument, Daniel, but that at the moment that states try to exert beyond their borders, they also become entangled in other spaces from which it's so much harder for them to detangle themselves. I really like the argument that it's not just the state territorializing cyberspace, but cyberspace also impacting the state and its orderings. Fernanda.
Yeah, no, I would like to address Milton's question, but if Daniel wants to address your comment, he can go first.
No, go right ahead. I'm still thinking about a few things earlier.
Yeah, sure. No, I'd just like to respond to a very important point that Milton did about the agency of indigenous people when we see Starlink coming to their territories. Let's be very clear here that the colonial processes, the violence that are related to colonial processes have always been faced with action. from native people. Like they always, who decolonize or who are decolonizing this world since the beginning are the native people who are there facing all the violence that comes to their territories. So of course there is always action, agents, if you want, when they are selecting Starlink to connect. However, it's a bit complicated to talk about just to have that understanding of economic selection, as we have in the US, with that understanding of the liberal individual who goes there and select a product and they pay for that. It's a bit complicated because when you see the values in the communities, we are not talking about the same values as we see in the Western society. So this is one thing. We need to understand what are the values that these people are working with to have that internet there. And the values that I've learned as I'm doing this ethnographical work is just the idea of comunalidad, the idea that, okay, we don't have communality. We don't have internet in this territory. We don't even have telephone in this territory because telco companies said it's not profitable to come here. So, but we want connectivity. We want the right to communicate. We communicate among ourselves. One. Second, spectrum for us is air. So you call spectrum, we call air. So this is part of our territory. We should make sure that we can use that, not as a product, because they are part of the territory. The territory is not outside them. So this is very important. Like when we are talking about this way that digital technology are coming to these territories in the way that they are, I would say the way that I look at it is they bring this colonial power embedded in their code, in their infrastructure. I even say, as we all say that for a long, long time, that protocols are language. And then if we think about protocols as language, we think about how language has been imposed into native people in a way that some communities do not even speak their native language anymore. They speak the colonial language like Spanish. This work specifically that I'm talking here is about Celtal and Zapoteco, is in Mexico. So I'll just make this point for us to think about what are the means of colonialism. And to Alexander's point, congratulations to Brazil. I would say congratulations to the many IXPs that were built, thinking that this should help ISPs to interconnect, independent of the big telcos that we have. Today, the small ISPs mean the fifth force. When we see like we have 4 internet providers who are also telecommunication companies, and the 5th one would be the small ISPs combined, because they are so huge. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of ISPs because of that.
Well, I just do not agree with Fernanda on this issue of code, or language inscribing colonialism. I think this is based on like a view of human society in which there are these nuggets of pure, innocent, local and indigenous culture, which are somehow, every interaction with the outside world is an act of domination rather than an act of exchange. And we're not going to solve that issue here, but I completely don't agree with your worldview on that. And I think it's really, the satellite issue is a good example of why I think it leads you astray. So you're saying these people can't get connectivity locally from their own society, but they want it by buying a satellite dish from a foreign provider are somehow being colonized, and that there's no distinction between that and a bunch of troops marching in and forcing them to use this satellite dish. And again, I think if you eliminate that distinction, you're really in trouble. Number one, you're also promoting this sort of authoritarianism of whoever is in power locally, right? It's not like there's no power in this local society. What about the people who want connectivity? Shouldn't they be able to get it by whatever means they can get it most efficiently?
I'd like to give the opportunity for Fernanda to respond, and then make a final round along the panelists for the famous last words, and then end it up. So Fernanda, then Daniel, and then Francesca.
Yeah, very briefly. Milton, I would be surprised if you agreed. So I'm completely fine with that. And I think this makes sense because I am your reader, so I couldn't expect you to agree. The second thing is there is action, and of course, indigenous people can do whatever they think it's better for them. So I'm not here selling rules for what they should do or not. What I'm doing is analyzing what this infrastructure and what this code is bringing with it, and what it is, and then analyzing that with the lived experiences of these people. If we ignore code, if we ignore infrastructure, it only think in terms of market and option. This is a market option. Let's buy internet, as we have understood in the US, where I am right now, and I see my colleagues and students thinking in this way. We are just losing the opportunity to see the politics that is embedded into code and infrastructure. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Fernanda. Daniel.
Okay, my comment is more of a question rather than the usual way. I was pondering a point that Milton made earlier, where's the geopolitics, and I do think Fernanda made the important point that sort of infrastructure and what companies do also geopolitical. But I kept coming back to this question. If the internet came into existence today, would we expect it to develop into the kind of global network that we have? And I can't help but think no, because looking back, the development of the internet sort of dependent on the one hand, what I call the normative hegemony is sort of in the tech world, that interconnectivity should be sort of the cornerstone around which this whole thing is based, but also sort of a political framework or a political situation, what we now call the liberal moment of sort of the post-Cold War situation, where for a while interdependence was seen as a good thing. But I think this has shifted. Maybe a post-globalization period where interdependence is seen as weakness and as vulnerability. So given these circumstances, I'm not sort of, well, I don't think we have the normative environment in which the internet as we think we have it today would evolve. However, I'm not sure if this is necessarily a completely bad thing, because the internet that we have today is great, but it also is deeply unequal, as Fernanda reminds us. So I don't want to valorize this whole thing, but I also think it could be a lot worse, actually, and it's going to get a bit worse in a while. I don't, as I said, I don't really have a comment, but this is more sort of a collection of thoughts that.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Francesca.
Yes, just a quick word, because I was in a seminar this morning when I was where I was discussing the cross-fertilization between STS approaches and cognate approaches, such as information sciences or political sciences and so on. And I was asked a question about, so do you think that STS is a part of X disciplinary approach? I don't remember which one it was. Or do you think that this one is a part of another? And I was like, I think that it has never been less pertinent to try and put like hierarchies on on what fields, disciplines, and related methodological instruments are, and where they come from, and so. And it has been very clear, I think, and that special issue that I pointed at has been a very good illustration of that, that we really need a complementarity between those. And like, for example, to figure out what the control points in internet infrastructures in a specific region is, I think that we need the political geography of data routing, and we need to be able to speak to the technical actors, ISPs, and the other to test hypotheses that might derive from looking at maps and see, okay, I see a control point here. Does it mean what I think it means? And then we need the political science to make sense of globally of these things with regime theories and so on. So I think that bottom line, things like fragmentation and sovereignty and digital colonialism and everything that we talked about tonight really do need these layers of methodology to be addressed, and we do well to work towards that, I think.
Perfect. Milton?
Oh, okay. This is our closing comments. Well, I think I would just echo what Daniel said. If the internet were to develop today, would it happen at all? And my answer is pretty unambiguous. I think the answer is clearly no. I think academics have been complaining about the neoliberal normative hegemony for like 3 decades, and now we are learning the hard way what is the alternative to that neoliberal hegemony, and it is what I call neo-mercantilism. Sort of 17th century protectionism and national security rules all, and we're not going to like the alternative. I think we're going to learn that it is, you know, we entered into this world of liberalism with countries like the United States having 94% telephone penetration and countries in Africa having less than 1%. And now there's been a massive equalization. We've seen countries where almost everybody was poor, like China, suddenly being rising into the middle class. And I think the global openness and free trade has done an amazing things for human society. It's got its problems, but they're like really secondary regulatory problems that we should be able to handle. And we need to maintain the connectivity and the free flow of people, ideas, information, goods, and we're going to be better off if we do.
I hope that you will all at home, behind your computer, on your way, on a mobile device, might be even in a plane because of mobile internet connectivity. I'd like to thank these great speakers who I am personally highly indebted to for learning from and thinking with, and I really hope that we can continue doing that in the coming years, because there are clearly a lot of policy issues, theoretical issues, empirical issues, methodological issues that we still need to solve, and for that we clearly need all the brain capacity that we have. So I hope that the students enjoyed this, also found some inspiration to help us bring this field and bring these issues further, not only for bringing the academic field further, but also informing policy discussions and also industry decisions. So thanks a lot, great authors. Thanks for bringing in so many interdisciplinary areas and different backgrounds and perspectives. And thanks all. And if you all want to continue more thinking and talking about this, I invite you all to have a look at the Critical Infra Lab Lounge event. I'm sharing the link where we will discuss similar discussions on April 13th and 14th. But before that, of course, already on March 23rd, at the next Geopolitics of Technology session here with ACES, Duitsland Instituut, and the Stiftung Neue Verantwortung. So again, thanks a lot to all, and have a great evening. Thanks for all the fish. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Niels.
Thank you.
Thank you all.